Welcome to a minisode of Project Geekology. I am one of your hosts, Anthony, and joining me as always is
Dakota.
well,
I don't know why I did
Dakota.
that.
This is actually, I think this is your first minisode, right?
I feel very honored. I'm very honored to be on this podcast right now. I've never personally done a minisode. Like I said, I'm humbled. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think I've been the one that has been doing most of the minisodes. So
Yeah.
So yeah, this minisode we're gonna be, we talked about it last week. We're gonna be covering, like what's a good jumping point for Star Wars. I guess like depending on where you are in Star Wars. I mean, if you're brand new or if you've been in for a little while and you don't know where to go, so get out your time sabers and
So yeah, I came up with this idea. I pitched it to Anthony because I've gotten a couple DMs and comments over the past couple of weeks as I've been working on my Star Wars timeline that I was working on, which is now released. It's called the Time Saber. You can find it, a link to download that in the description below. But I've gotten a lot of DMs from people who have either never watched Star Wars or haven't fully gotten into Star Wars, and they want an in. They want to understand, like, what do I need to know to like jump into this? Where do I start? Do I start with the prequels? Do I start with the original trilogy? Do I start with the Acolyte? And there's a number of answers that we can give you, and we're gonna just try to maneuver through the galaxy. Not just the movies and shows, but like if you have already seen the shows, but you want to get into some of the books maybe, or some of the video games. I know, Anthony, you've played a lot more of the Star Wars video games than I have, and I've read a lot more of the Star Wars books than you have. So it'll be a good kind of back and forth with that kind of stuff. So I'm excited to talk about just our experience with Star Wars and how we would introduce this to others. And have you ever had the opportunity to introduce Star Wars to another person?
I have. I actually have. It's
a beautiful thing. It is a beautiful thing.
It is a beautiful thing. I introduced an ex-girlfriend into the Star Wars fold, and she became a pretty big fan afterwards. So, pretty much,
That's awesome.
it's keeping up with a lot of the animated stuff and checking out that stuff. I mean, look, I got the ball rolling, but she kept it going.
Which I think is just such a cool thing with Star Wars, is that it's a constantly growing universe, it's a constantly growing galaxy, and there's so many jumping on points and ways that you can expand your knowledge and just your exposure to this galaxy. So a brief overview: Star Wars is not necessarily a fantasy film. It's not necessarily science fiction, but some people call it science fantasy. It's kind of like a space opera where you're not going to get hard science fiction stuff where every single thing in this universe makes sense from a scientific perspective, but you're also not going to get the typical fantasy, like dragons and swords and all that. It's a blend of both genres. And in 1977, the director of the original Star Wars, George Lucas, created this masterpiece, and it's now considered the fourth movie in the Skywalker saga, which comprises 9 films. So the first movie that came out was just originally called Star Wars, and later it was retitled Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. The second movie, like it was Empire Strikes Back, it was later retitled Episode 5: The Empire Strikes Back, and the third movie in that trilogy is now retitled Episode 6: Return of the Jedi. So that is the original trilogy that came out between 1977 and 1983 that spawned millions and millions of fans and the imagination of so many. And it's probably the most influential film of all time, probably outside of The Wizard of Oz or something like that,
And just to think, the creator of Star Wars didn't even bet on his own movie.
Yeah. I mean, that's a story in and of itself, but there's a story that he and Spielberg, were betting on each other's films as being the more successful one. I believe the movie in question that George Lucas was betting on was Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
It was.
And Spielberg made a bet about Star Wars, basically. And I forget what the actual stakes were in the bet, but it basically led to ludicrous sums of money over the years to Spielberg's pocket, because I think it was like a portion of the proceeds of this movie. So crazy, like
Well, you
yeah,
know,
no.
I mean, look, Spielberg, he has a good eye, and you know, he probably got a glimpse of it. I could imagine that Spielberg came to set, saw the stuff, was really like sold on it, and had like a really good intuition about it, and yeah, boom, here we are.
So fast forward almost 15 years later, the movies get re-released in the 90s, the late 90s, in the lead up to this new trilogy that George Lucas is working on, which begins with episode 1, The Phantom Menace, in 99, then Attack of the Clones in 2002, and episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, in 2005. And that, for in that period of time, these films were mostly maligned. Like, people outside of us who were growing up with these films and loved them, the general fan base kind of hated him, and they kind of bullied George Lucas away from like certain plot lines. Like, there's a reason why there are some characters that aren't like super prominent later on in the prequels, like the Jar Jar Binks character, who you may or may not know of. We're going to stray from any spoiler discussions in this minisode, just so that you feel comfortable, learning and exploring the Star Wars universe with us without having to worry about whether or not we're going to spoil anything.
We want you to experience and enjoy that for the first time without us dropping any huge plot lines.
Right. In the interim between the prequels and the sequels that exist now, George Lucas created a children's TV series called The Clone Wars, and it's a beloved TV series that kept getting better every season. A lot of people think that is a good place for some people to, get into the movies, especially if you're starting with the prequels. We'll talk a little bit about like why that might not be a really good entry or whatever in a bit, but
You may be a little confused.
you will be confused. Yeah, I don't recommend that, but we'll talk about that in a sec. And then in 2012, during the height of the Clone Wars, I think it was like season 4 or 5, Disney bought Lucasfilm and Star Wars, so Disney now owns the rights to Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Willow, and a couple other properties from throughout the years. And come 2015, the first of the sequels comes out, The Force Awakens. 2 years later, this is where it kind of starts going crazy with new content, actually. Because you had, in 2015, The Force Awakens, then in 2016, Rogue One, then in 2017, The Last Jedi, 2018, you had Solo, and then 2019, you had The Rise of Skywalker. So it was a lot of movies in very quick succession, and then we haven't had a new Star Wars film in the past 5 years, since
Right. And
The Rise of Skywalker.
And then also towards the end of 2019 with the launch of Disney Plus, we get The Mandalorian also. But
Yes.
so I know that sounds a bit crazy with
We're giving an overview right now.
Right. We're giving a little bit of an overview. I would say, as far as entry point into Star Wars, I feel like, and I know that this is probably, depending on whoever it is, they'll probably want to crucify me, but it is what it is. But I feel like if you go with prequels first, that's okay. If you want to go with release order first, that is also okay.
Yeah, so I agree. I think that those are the two main entry points into the Star Wars series. I think it's foolish if you decide to start with the Disney era Star Wars movies. Not because they're bad, I love most of them, but they are very clear sequels. Whereas the original trilogy only kind of hinted at stuff before. And so you can jump onto that. And even though, it's a little outdated with certain things, they still look and are great movies, like fantastic movies, game-changing movies. With the prequels, you kind of get, and the prequels have also aged a little bit at the same time, but they pioneered new technology just like the original trilogy. Like, the prequels were the first really, I think Attack of the Clones was the first true digital movie ever filmed on digital instead of film. The Phantom Menace, the first movie, is the first movie that had a fully CGI character interacting with humans for a good portion of the movie, that being Jar Jar Binks. So these pioneered new tech, and that was one of the goals of George Lucas. Like, he wanted to do something new with these movies, and he did that with each movie that he was involved with. So I love it for that, and I think that when you go into the prequels for a first timer, it changes the experience in an interesting way, because you don't, like, hypothetically, you have no knowledge of what happens in the original trilogy. You get to experience the Star Wars story told in a way that most people will never get to experience that. You know, if you actually like follow it from the chronological beginning of Phantom Menace through to the end of The Rise of Skywalker, you will see a through line throughout that is really powerful. Not that you won't get that with the original trilogy. And I do still recommend starting with the original trilogy, but I don't think starting with the prequels is a bad idea, if that makes sense.
Right, that makes sense. So I would say starting with the original trilogy is more coming from like a rite of passage type of deal. Like, a lot of people who grew up on Star Wars, like before all this content came out, such as Dakota and I and numerous other people, like that's what I watched. When I grew up, I watched the original trilogy because that's all that existed, So
Yeah.
if you want to watch it from that kind of sense, like the way people like us and like older experience Star Wars and have a connection to the fan base in that kind of way, that is a really interesting aspect. But if you're somebody that, especially like, I mean, Dakota, would appreciate this too. I mean, if you're somebody that's like very into following the timeline of something, and if you want to follow something in order, then by all means go with it.
Yeah. So there's also, do you think that there are any other places or any other shows perhaps that would be a good entry point for people who haven't watched any Star Wars? Because I've introduced people to The Mandalorian, because it's kind of, for the most part, The Mandalorian is kind of a one-of-a-kind sort of thing, where it's a, episodic series on Disney Plus that follows a character, protecting this other character. And you don't need too much information. You don't need any information for the first season, as far as like the rest of the Star Wars galaxy goes. You'll learn it as you go.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was going to say.
There's an actor on the show, Bill Burr, a very popular comedian, who wasn't a fan of Star Wars. He had never seen Star Wars. He didn't understand what was going on. But Jon Favreau, the producer of The Mandalorian, basically said, no, this is a Star Wars thing. You just do it, you'll get it, and it'll be great. And it turned out like, he's one of the best characters on that show, in my opinion. He's such a good character. And he became a fan of Star Wars through that role. So it's possible to start with The Mandalorian, but it does get tricky once you get to the end of the second season, I think.
I would say like kind of throughout, you may be a little safe in the beginning of season 2, but yeah, they start incorporating elements from the larger the larger narrative. So if you do want to kind of check out something that's Star Wars related, and you don't want to, like, you kind of want to like watch something that's episodic and not like a movie, then yeah, like, I mean, that is a really good show. It's really cool. It plays out differently than the rest of Star Wars, at least that first season does. It's very much so like, I would say that if you're somebody that's a really big fan of the TV show Firefly, then you would love that show.
Okay, yeah, it definitely has that like cowboy western vibe. With past season 2, when you get into like the spin-off shows like Book of Boba Fett and Ahsoka, I don't think that's those are good places to start watching Star Wars at all. But if you start with Mandalorian season 1, watch season 2, and get interested by the characters that are introduced in the series that have bigger meanings in the Star Wars universe, then I would go back to the original trilogy. Then I would go back to the prequels and learn about the galaxy and what has happened up to this point to get to The Mandalorian, because it takes place after most of those movies. So yeah, I think those are the 3 places that I would suggest a newcomer to start with, is either The Mandalorian TV show through the first 2 seasons. Don't jump into season 3 until after you watch a couple movies. The original trilogy being the optimal version of, the optimal starting spot, and then the prequels.
Yeah, I would definitely, I mean, of all of that, I would definitely recommend hopping into the movies maybe first.
Yes.
Just, kind of get more, like, I feel like it acquaints you to Star Wars a lot more.
Yeah.
You can enjoy the show The Mandalorian, especially that first season, without watching it. If you want to check out like a different show so related to Star Wars, but nothing with too many Jedi or anything, then yeah, definitely that first season is going to be great for
Right.
you. But yeah, I would definitely hop into the movies. And like we said, you can start with the prequels, you can start with the original trilogy. Just start with those before hopping into the sequel trilogy. If you go with original trilogy, watch those, double back and go to the prequel trilogy, then go to the sequel trilogy. Or if you just want to go straight through prequels, original, sequels, just make sure that you watch those first two first.
Trilogies, yeah. The
Yeah,
first two trilogies
those
first.
first two trilogies first before you hop into that sequel trilogy.
So we have to talk a little bit about the animated series in conjunction with stuff like the live action Mandalorian show, because we have these shows that are easier to get into for the vast majority of people, which is like the Mandalorian and stuff. But you do have Clone Wars, which bridges the storylines between this episode 2 and episode 3, where there's a galactic war that's happening throughout the entire galaxy between two warring sides, and the Jedi are caught in the center of it, the Jedi being the heroes of the story. And then you have another show called Star Wars Rebels, which kind of comes closer to the original trilogy. It's like right before the original trilogy and like all that. You also have what do you think that you would watch stuff like Rogue One and Solo on a chronological watch, or would you watch the Skywalker saga first and then go back to those other movies?
We'll be back after a quick break.
I'm Dan Heath. On the What It's Like to Be podcast, I ask folks about their jobs, like what keeps a TV meteorologist up at night.
When I'm at work and there's a tornado coming into town, my husband and my kids have to get into the tornado shelter without me.
What keeps a welder driven?
I never am satisfied. I always know I can do better.
And what keeps a hairstylist on her toes?
I know she likes that Holly Berry haircut, but she doesn't look like Holly Berry.
Find out on What It's Like to Be, wherever you get your podcasts.
So if I was somebody that wanted to watch, if I was going straight chronological media, then, and I'm just sticking to the movies, then maybe incorporate them. But if you want to just stick with the main narrative storyline of the Skywalker saga, then you don't need them. Rogue One and Solo are supplementary films. They're not exactly super important for, like, I mean, they explain like important stuff. They show how certain things happened, or the intro to Han Solo, but I feel like you don't have to worry about it too much until maybe like if you want to come back and watch them and kind of fill in the blanks. Just like we were talking about the animated series, you may watch through the prequel trilogy and understand that there's a lot of plot holes or there's some stuff missing. That show fills in a lot of plot holes. It explains a lot of different aspects that may give you a fuller picture of the period between episode 2 and 3 and why certain things happen. It makes things make sense.
Yeah, but when it comes to the animated series, whether it be the Clone Wars or Rebels or Star Wars Resistance, definitely watch the movies that occur around those time periods prior to watching those animated series.
Absolutely.
Just it colors in the entire like scene of the galaxy. Like definitely watch the prequels, like all the prequels, before touching the Clone Wars series. Definitely watch all of the original trilogy before watching Rebels. Definitely watch the sequel trilogy before watching Resistance. Those are, like we said, supplementary, but they do enhance your experience.
They do. They do. Just kind of like the novels too. Like the novels aren't like 100% essential, but they cover like periods of like they cover gaps, or they cover aspects that are or things that are going on around movies and TV shows that are happening around that particular period. But would you also agree that like, the books are like supplementary and you don't have to worry about hopping into books right away? You could stick with the movies, just like straight up movies.
Yes, you can definitely, you don't need to ever touch a Star Wars novel, a Star Wars comic book, a Star Wars video game to understand the story of Star Wars. Doesn't make you a bigger fan if you've read all of them or read none of them. You can just, you're a Star Wars fan. Welcome to the club.
Right. I mean, honestly, you could just stick with the movies and be fine.
Before we jump into like media tie-in stuff, I just want to briefly touch on the show The Acolyte. I highly discourage anyone from starting watching Star Wars there. Not because it's bad or anything like that, even though, you will probably hear that online that it is bad from certain group of people. It's just it's so far removed from the Star Wars story that we know, because it's 100 years prior to even the prequels. So it's just a bad spot, and right now we don't know, there's not a lot going on in that time period. So if you really like The Acolyte, you're not going to get anything like that later on, so just wait for your love of Star Wars to grow before jumping into The Acolyte is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And the cool thing about Star Wars is that I feel like it has pieces of media that appease to many people. Like if you're somebody who really loves to read, awesome, there's so many like Star Wars novels and comics and graphic novels and stuff. If you're a gamer, dude, there's a bunch of like in canon video games too. So
yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, because some of you probably have watched the show, or a lot of you probably watched the films, but have never gotten into the wider stuff. How about we'll start with video games, canon video games that you should probably check out. And Anthony, you can probably take the reins on that, and we'll talk a little bit about novels and stuff that you might be interested in afterwards.
So I would say one of my absolute top series that they have going on is the Jedi series. There's Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. Obviously, you want to play Jedi Fallen Order first before you play Jedi Survivor, because Jedi Survivor, it's a sequel, and it's, some people may tell you like, no, you could play Survivor, but no, you definitely want to play Fallen Order 1 because it's an amazing game, and 2, there's going to be elements that you would miss if you skip the game. And these games cover the period between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope.
Yeah, it's like right smack dab in the middle of that time period.
Exactly. And we have there's also some other games that are technically canon that they're not really essential to the story, but like, we have Star Wars Battlefront, there's 1 and 2, like the newer ones.
And Battlefront 2 had a pretty significant story or campaign mode.
It did.
Which kind of pushed the confines of the original trilogy out a little bit. So you found out what happened next. So I do think that while it's not like we said, this is supplemental storytelling to the actual films, but it does color in this universe, especially if you like that era, especially like of Return of the Jedi. You like that film, you want to play something like that, jump into Battlefront 2. It's a great storyline. Right,
yeah, it does cover kind of like a period of like right before Return of the Jedi, and then like after that, and then like towards the beginning of like the Resistance era.
And what's cool about Battlefront is that you're actually following the villains as they come to realize that, oh crap, we're villains.
Yeah.
So I think that was a really cool twist.
Yeah, it adds a pretty cool perspective that, that there are definitely, it makes sense that there would be people that would defect from the Empire, because, not everybody in the Empire is like, rotten to the core. That's just a job to them. And then like you kind of realize like, oh, what we're doing is really bad. Yeah. And that's essentially that story. So there's that. I know that we have some, I'm trying to think.
There's a couple of VR games, but I feel like it's a harder thing to like break into, because it's just not a popular medium.
There's a couple of Star Wars VR games that like we don't really have to get too much into. There's Tales from Galaxy's Edge. That's very supplemental. There's Vader Immortal. Oh, well, there's also Star Wars Squadrons if you're really cool into like flight sim stuff, or like
Yeah,
space sim stuff.
I heard Squadrons had a pretty cool story too.
Yes, yes. Squadrons is really cool. And I got to actually try it out with the hands-on throttle and stick. So like actually using a flight stick to like play the game. Yeah,
Really?
yeah, it's really cool.
All right. So let's jump into some novels, because even though there are a ton of really great comic book runs that exist within the Star Wars canon, my real love when it comes to like tie-in stuff is like the novels. So some of my favorite stuff happens to, I'll just talk about a couple books that I think really are worth your while if you are into different types of Star Wars content. A new book that came out called The Living Force. This is by John Jackson Miller. It's basically a year before The Phantom Menace. So if you're a big fan of the prequels, specifically The Phantom Menace, and you want to get to know more about like the Jedi Masters and how they work together to overcome certain things, this is a fantastic book. I know one that you've read, Anthony, Dark Disciple.
Yes.
Is fantastic, especially if you've gone through the entirety of the Clone Wars and you need a little bit more of that. Dark Disciple is really good. And there's another one called Brotherhood that came out a couple years back that is the very start of the Clone Wars by Mike Chen. And it's a really great Anakin and Obi-Wan book. You know, if you want to experience more of their being, you know, by the end of Attack of the Clones, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker are no longer master and apprentice. You know, Anakin has become a knight at the end of that. So, no, he hasn't become a knight yet, but he will. And that book is that story of him becoming a Jedi Knight. And it's really good. So that's one I highly recommend. If you want to get more into like young adult stuff, one of the best books that you can read is the Lost Stars young adult novel, which basically takes you through the eyes of two other individuals who are not in the original trilogy, but it shows the events of the original trilogy from like both sides of the war, and it ends just spectacularly. It's one of the best Star Wars books around. And more recently they've jumped into like the High Republic period, which, you know, that's a whole other beast, you know, in terms of where to start with that. And where I would suggest starting with the High Republic is the first novel, which, Anthony, you've read, and we've actually covered on the show before, The Light of the Jedi. It's just such a great read. It introduces you to so many great characters, and it introduces you to an entire era that we've never explored before. And I think that, for me, was the most exciting bit.
And then we get two other books out of that. It becomes like a trilogy.
It becomes a trilogy of adult novels, but there's also young adult novels
Sprinkled
and
in.
junior novels and comic books, and it's a whole publishing initiative. But definitely, if you're going to start with anything High Republic, maybe save for The Acolyte. I would say start with Light of the Jedi. You know, like you can watch The Acolyte without having read The High Republic at all. But if you're interested in getting into the books and stuff, definitely start with Light of the Jedi. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. It's absolutely fantastic.
Anthony, any final thoughts for people who are trying to not only get into Star Wars for the first time, but like expand their reach within the Star Wars universe?
If you are interested in kind of looking, if you want to see something visually as far as a timeline, Dakota has a really great time saber whip thing that he created. We're going to put it in the show notes. He has a whole video about it. He also has a free copy for pretty much anybody to download if they want to download it. And if you really, really like it and you want like a higher res version of that, he has that over on his Patreon. But we will put that video along with his channel in the show notes, and so you can go and check that out. And that video could be like a really good supplement to this episode. And yeah, like, you know, anything else that you want to add?
No, thank you for plugging that project that I was working on. Yeah, so the Time Saber, you'll find it in the show notes. It's a project that I've been working on for a long time. It tries to collect everything within canon, or as much as canon as possible, into a singular timeline, from comic books to video games to movies and shows. I try to capture everything. Obviously, I don't expect anyone to read and experience everything linearly, like on a chronological thing. But if you want to experience, or if you want to visualize what the universe looked like at this era, what was going on in other parts of the galaxy during certain eras, this is a really cool tool. But anyway, guys, this minisode has gone on for a little bit longer than we expected, so we're going to call it quits here. Thank you so much for listening to us here on Project Geekology. And again, you'll find any links to anything that we mentioned in our show notes, including our socials. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye.
May the Force be with you.